And
Sounds
thank
good.
you everyone for tuning in to this webinar series. I'm Stephanie Schrader, the Education Outreach Diversity Managing Director of C-DEBI, and this is presented by C-DEBI, and it focuses on professional development skills needed both in and out of academia. We have this webinar series every other month, but we're skipping December, so our next one will be in February. Today's speaker is Dr. Andy Fisher. He is a professor of hydrogeology at the University of California, Santa Cruz. He's also a C-DEBI co-I. So we will be talking about how to talk to different audiences as a scientist and his own experiences dealing with the public, press, and politicians. Before we start, a couple of housekeeping items. This webinar is being recorded. You will be muted during the talk, so if you have a question, please use the chat box, and you can enter questions at any time, but we will save the questions for the end. And with that, I'll turn it over to Andy. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Stephanie. It's really great to be here and get a chance to talk to you a little bit about some experiences that I've had within engaging with the public and with the press, with politicians and agency representatives. At first, when I was asked to give this presentation, I thought, maybe I'm not the right person for this, but then as I look back over the last 2 decades, I realized I'd been involved in a variety of different capacities in communicating scientific results to non-technical audiences, and I thought, well, why not? So what this is going to be today is kind of a series of stories broken up into 3 sections as indicated by the title. And I'm just going to run through a few of these ideas. Please feel free to leave messages on the chat window, and unless there's a major issue and Stephanie can interrupt me, I'll hold the questions till the end, but if you think of something that you want to be sure to ask about, please go ahead and enter it there, and then we'll go through some questions. So the first thing is, why bother to be ready for this? And I think there's a lot of reasons why it's important for scientists working today to worry about these kind of interactions. First, you can't avoid it. Issues are going to come up whether you want them to or not. None of us is going to get left alone in our offices or in our labs or on ships and never ever bothered. We're going to be asked questions. There will be press releases or press conferences or phone calls or just queries from people that you meet on an airplane. And it is important to be ready to respond to those in a constructive way. Part of the reason for that is because we need the public, the press, the politicians who help to fund our work to care about what we do. So there really is a self-interest here. But more than that, there's a broader obligation, I think, that we have to the public. Most of us are supported, at least in part, through public funds. And it used to be kind of implicit and not discussed very much, but now it's quite explicit that we have an obligation to take the results of our work and try to get them out to a community broader than the 5 or 10 people who do mostly what we do and are able to understand at the high level the technical work. The other thing is that it can actually help you personally and professionally. And I've seen this. It can result in new ideas. It can help you to be a better communicator to your technical audience. And it can actually lead to money in the long run, because as you get your voice out there and you become known as someone who is an authority, ultimately that does come back to help you in the long run. And finally, I think it really can make you a better scientist. And I take this aspect quite seriously in learning how to explain topics clearly and concisely and simply. I think it's actually improved my proposals and my papers and talks that I've given at technical meetings, even when speaking to peer groups. I think in many cases, talks that we see at AGU or GSA or other meetings, they're often pitched way too high for the audience, even audiences of other scientists, because most people aren't aware of all the nuances of what we do. So learning how to simplify and streamline our stories actually makes us more effective as scientists. All right, so let me just give you a brief background. I started out as a geologist. When I was a major in college, we took 5 classes where we looked at thin sections. That tells you kind of how traditional my geology background was. But I was excited about hydrothermal systems, and I went to grad school specifically to learn about seafloor hydrogeology. And just to put this in perspective, in the mid 80s, there was no web, and we had the most rudimentary email that you can imagine, and it only operated within the graduate student circles at the school where I was a student. I took a job after that with the ocean drilling program as a staff scientist, and that job was part scientist, part technician, part editor, and I didn't realize it, but part PR person as well. I had to learn how to represent the program both to the technical community but also to the public at large. And I'll talk about that a little bit. Around that time, it's worth noting that the National Science Foundation still did all of its proposal work as hard copy. And I remember, as a staff scientist at ODP, standing by the copier and making 20 hard copies of every proposal, and then having to pay special for color copies that had to be collated in to the package of all the other materials. I remember there were runners going around getting signatures. Everything was hard copy. So we didn't have digital media. We didn't have access to a lot of the PR elements that we have available today. While I was at Texas A&M, where I was working as a staff scientist, I began thinking seriously about retooling to do freshwater work. And in my next job, which was at Indiana University, my wife had a postdoc, and I went along and just tried to cobble together some kind of a soft money life at the university and with the State Geological Survey. I started to do groundwater research. And that ended up being very helpful because when I applied for my job here at Santa Cruz, they were looking for someone who could cover certain classes as well as do, whatever research they wanted to do. So this was a big benefit for me in securing the job that I have now. I've been here since '95, and I'll note a couple other milestones. The National Science Foundation talked about broader impacts, but they were rather vague during the 1990s. It wasn't until '97 that there was specific guidance as to what broader impacts are. And even then, I remember quite well many of my senior colleagues really being put off by this, thinking that they shouldn't have to justify what they do. It ought to be a given that science is important, and they shouldn't be asked to waste their time trying to convince other people it was important or tell them what they did. Their job was to produce the science, and it was other people's jobs to talk to the hoi polloi. The formal expectations for broader impacts at NSF, that was formalized in documentation only about 10 years ago. And of course, now it's a significant part of every proposal, not just for NSF, but for other agencies as well. And the other big change, of course, that we're all aware of is the requirement that we post data and make sure that our results are put out and made public in a timely manner. And I'd argue that the need for effective public communication goes hand in hand with the need to put our data out there to our own technical communities. All right, so that's a little bit of background. So the first section of this is on speaking with the press. And the first thing I'd say is decide which studies that you're working on you want to communicate. Not every paper and every study and every thesis is going to be press ready. And an example of where this can go wrong was when I was working at the ocean drilling program, ODP had a deal worked out with Nature. This is before the days of Nature Geoscience and all the other Nature communications and so forth. This was just Nature. And the deal was that Nature would publish a one-page synopsis of every expedition, and they would get first crack at telling about the exciting results that were coming out. But what it meant was that every single time the drill ship went out, the staff scientists and the PR people and the chief scientists had to cobble together a press release that was Nature quality. And I'll tell you for a fact that not every expedition generated results that Nature wanted to cover. This created a lot of friction, and I actually think in the long run it did a disservice to the program, because after some years, Nature stopped that agreement. They wouldn't carry every cruise as a rule, and it was often a fight to get stories out that scientists thought were important, but the Nature PR folks just didn't really think were worth having. The other thing to realize is that you only get a short window when new research is considered sort of exciting and provocative and worthwhile to be publicized. So choosing which projects you want to push and choosing a window in which you can try to get your story out, I think is important also for keeping your sanity. You can't just keep everything going all the time, and you're not going to be able to get a story out on every single paper. The second recommendation is draft your own press release and then send it to whoever it is in your institution is responsible for communicating interesting scientific results. Here at UC Santa Cruz, we have a public office, a public outreach office, and sometimes I'd contact our science writer, Tim Stevens, and I'd say, hey, I've got a story, and Tim would say, well, that's great, but I'm really kind of busy this week. And what I realized was that if I drafted the press release and then sent it to him, it could actually help. And in fact, he then was able to edit that press release, send it back to me, and he was able to get it out in a timely way so it coincided with the publication. In fact, we did that a couple years ago. We had a paper in Science Advances on the first geothermal heat flow measurement made below the West Antarctic ice sheet. And that was exactly the situation where he was really busy, but I ended up writing it and then sending it to him. And then he sent it back with edits, and we got it out, and we actually got a fair bit of press. The other thing was that I contacted NSF. They have a PR office. It turned out at the time, they said, well, we're at our fiscal closeout, and we don't have time to work on your press release. And I was able to say, well, that's okay. I've got a draft. Let me send it to you. And the next thing we knew, we were featured on the NSF website as one of their 5 scientific discoveries of the week that rotates around on their homepage. And it actually stayed up for 2 weeks. And then we got a bunch more press. We got the Weather Channel. We got, a few other print media outlets. We got CNN did a little tiny clip on us. But none of that would have happened if we hadn't taken that step to prepare that press release. I should note that writing a press release is very different from writing a paper, and it does take practice, but that's where your home institution PR office can help you. You should look at some press releases and try to use them as templates to then write your own story. It's important to include easily accessible language. Make sure that you put the key result in the first sentence. Tell a human story. People love to read about the people that are involved. Make sure to use language that's relatively simple and evocative. And press releases work well when there are quotes. So what I'll often do is I'll write quotes for myself and I'll write quotes for my colleagues. And then I'll send them to them and say, is this an okay quote for you? In that way, I'm able to sort of create a story in the press release, which is then sort of public ready. And then don't be afraid to distribute the press release when your campus is ready. They often have people they'll send it to, but you can send it on your own to people that you know. And you can make sure that it gets out to the local newspapers, to magazines, of course to Nature and Science, although they're usually monitoring these sorts of things, but also to Science News and to other outlets. Another thing that I learned kind of by surprise was you need to have graphics and video elements. Some years back, we had a paper that appeared in Nature, and it involved the first discovery that water could flow into one extinct seamount and then flow laterally through the crust 50 kilometers and then come out through another seamount. And this was a big story on the technical side. It was the first time that anyone had found the actual place where hydrothermal recharge below the seafloor occurs, and you could put your finger on the spot. So I immediately started, when Nature imposes an embargo, but then when the paper came out, they did a little release on it, and they actually had a News and Views article, which indicated that they thought it was kind of a high-profile paper. Well, I started getting phone calls, and one of the first things that all the media outlets asked was, where are your elements? Can we have your elements? And I didn't know what they meant, but what they were talking about were photographs, cartoons, images, anything that they could put up to grab people's attention. And all I could do was say, well, I can draw you something, or, I'd wave my hands around. But what I realized was I hadn't been ready. I needed those graphical elements to be ready when the story was originally released. So it turned out that we just couldn't do much. I tried to make a figure. One of my colleagues tried to make a figure. It looked pretty terrible. But I learned, I knew at the time that we had a science communications program here on campus, and that included a science illustration program. So I reached out to the director and asked if any of their students wanted to work on a project. And of course, they were looking for projects. They loved the opportunity to work with scientists. So I got connected to this amazing artist, and she met with me, and we talked about a piece of artwork that she could do, and she made a sketch, and we talked about that, and then she made a painting, and we talked about that, and she made edits, and eventually, after about 3 months, she came up with this really neat result. And what she ended up with was this image, which I subsequently scanned into Illustrator and then added a few annotations. So she did this picture as an acrylic artwork, right? So she painted this. And I ended up using it for future research on a similar topic. So we've done press releases where we've used this. We've used this on the department's website. I've used it on my website. I use it constantly in talks because while not being technically exactly accurate, it's so evocative of this idea that we're trying to get across. It's just been amazingly useful. And the artist, Nicole Rager, she's a professional scientific illustrator. You can find her online, and she actually features this image on her website. She lives in Chicago now. But it was a great opportunity for me to connect with somebody who could produce an element that I could then use for future talks and for future publicity. You can also create video elements if you have access to people. And if we have time at the end of this presentation, I'll show you a short video that we worked on with a videographer who came to see with us on an expedition. As I mentioned, you can contact people if you know them. So it's worth looking at the newspaper websites for the major metropolitan areas that either are near you or just are the biggest papers in the US. So this can include things like the New York Times, the Washington Post, the San Francisco Chronicle, the LA Times, the Chicago Tribune, the AP. You can find their science writers. Well, if you have a press release, don't be afraid, send it to them. Tell them, here's a story. If you're interested, I'm happy to talk. You don't want to bother them, but there's nothing wrong with you connecting with them directly. And don't forget about radio. If you have local radio stations, especially an NPR station, they often like to do local stories on exciting technical or scientific developments. So if you provide them with a little bit of info and just give them space, they may eventually come to you and ask to do a story. I'm going to note that sometimes the calendar is unlucky. When we had another study that was coming out on a related topic, I ended up getting a phone call from Joe Palca. And some of you may know he's a science reporter for the National Public Radio. And it was very exciting to get a phone call from him asking questions. And he called me on a Monday and indicated they were thinking of doing a story later in the week. And we had an interview on the phone, and then he was going to call me back. And then on Thursday, it was announced that the US was invading Afghanistan. And that was that. There were no science stories on Friday, and the window was closed. So sometimes you just can't control events. Sometimes things just happen. And it's interesting. He came to our campus about 10 years later, and I reached out to him. We had a little email exchange. We never ended up getting together because he was pretty busy. When we had another story that came out 2 years ago, I sent him an email. He was amused that I still remembered him. At that time, he didn't have time. It was fine. I'm not going to be pushy. But I'd say every 5 to 10 years, I've sent him a story. I don't want to overdo it because I want it to be clear that it's something that I think is worth reporting. But once you make a connection, follow up on it. Often there are really talented people who work with the media who want stories. And if you can provide them with some content, then they're actually going to be appreciative of the story that you have to tell. Another aspect of speaking with the press is being ready when you get a phone call or an email or there's a tweet or some other contact. In many cases, people in the media want to talk to you as an expert on a related topic. This sometimes happens through things like news and views in Nature, but it can also just happen when the news media pick up on someone else's story. But then if they know who you are because of an earlier contact or your presence, then they may contact you to get your comment on another story. They may also, of course, contact you about your own work. In either case, you kind of want to be ready. And so what I recommend is instead of answering the questions right away, even if you're not too busy at that moment, ask them if you can call them back in 5 minutes or 10 minutes, if possible. It gives you a chance to clear your head, familiarize yourself with what you want to say, get your talking points in order. If possible, if you get a contact by email, you might ask if they mind giving you some of the questions in advance. And again, it just lets you organize your thoughts and be better prepared, because during the interview, you want to keep it simple. You don't want to tell a complicated story. You want to tell 1 or 2 key points that you want to communicate, and you want to be ready to say those 1 or 2 points clearly and cleanly. If you get asked questions that are odd or they seem like bad questions, try to think about how to turn them into good questions. No one likes to be told that they don't understand enough to ask a question. Be patient. Sometimes in an interview, in fact, often in an interview, I have to explain the same concept multiple times. And be ready to be misunderstood. This is amazingly common even with high-profile media outlets. And I want to give you an example. 2 years ago, we had a big program that was developed in what we call recharge net metering for groundwater. This was a program that would allow people to put more water into the ground to recharge an aquifer and actually get a credit on their water bill, kind of like what power companies do with net metering for solar panels in some places. So I helped craft a press release for that. We got it out. It got picked up by several outlets. They were interested. And one phone call that I got that I was excited about was from Scientific American. And I thought, boy, this is the big time, because Scientific American is one of the outlets that really knows how to communicate science effectively. So I had 2 on the phone interviews, and they produced a story, and the story was terrible. The story used words and ideas that were inaccurate and even inflammatory. And for example, if you look at this headline here, they described our project as grabbing water. And I called Tom Ulesman back when this appeared, and I said, can you change that? Because a water grab is actually a term used in the law, and it's either illegal or it has negative connotations. People talk about grabbing other people's water. And we never talked about water grabbing, and we never used that word. And his response was, well, yeah, I didn't want to use it either, but my editor said it would be more exciting, so we put it in. And I pleaded with him. I said, this is going to hurt us. There were other things in the story that were also inaccurate and gave a negative impression about what we were doing. And they would actually raise doubts among our partners in the public. And I said, this is going to hurt our program. You're telling our story in a way that puts a terrible light on it, even though it's a positive story. Can you please fix these things? And I sent him a list of suggested edits. And unfortunately, they just refused. And so I was left with this story online, which I guess is okay because it's publicity, but it's really not a very positive story. Around the same time, I also got a phone call from the science writer at the San Jose Mercury News. Paul Rogers is one of the science writers, and there's another one, and now I'm blocking on her name in the heat of the moment here. She's terrific. And I talked to her for a long time, and she actually said, oh, this is interesting. How about if we get an artist to make a figure? Will you help us? And I just thought, oh my gosh, that's great. And they hired this graphic artist who made this amazing graphic. Well, the first version of the graphic wasn't quite right, and I gave them feedback, and they fixed it. They actually got it right. And then I offered to provide some fact-checking on the article, and she sent it to me, and I turned it around quickly because newspapers need to get things by deadline. You can't sit on it for 3 or 4 days like with a paper. But she took my feedback. And not every journalist is going to do that. In fact, arguably, it's in a gray area in terms of what journalists should do. They don't like to have their interview subjects editing their stories. But I try to frame it as, look, if you would like, I'm happy to look at your story and offer a fact check on it. And you can take or leave what I tell you. It's entirely up to you. But I make the offer. And I'd say about a third of the time, the journalists, who are often freelancers and don't have much expertise, they're often willing to allow that kind of feedback. One other point I'll just mention is to find out whether you're talking to a real reporter or an advocate. Sometimes, of course, people are more advocates or folks who kind of want to shake things up or make a stir. And you've got to think very carefully about doing an interview with those folks because it might not be in the interest of the story that you're trying to tell. They may try to use your information in a funny way. I've had situations where I've just refused to do an interview because I investigated who the person was and realized that it wouldn't be productive to talk to them. All right, I'm going to move on. That was the longest section, but I'm going to tell you a little bit about talking with politicians and agencies and then with the public. In the last 25 years, I've had interactions with, I realized, members of government going from the city level through county, states, and all the way up to the federal level. A lot of this has been in the last 10 years involving fresh water, but some of it goes back to my days in ocean drilling and talking about oceanography. One event that I can't recommend highly enough is AGU and AAAS and other organizations. They'll do a Science on the Hill event. And what they do is they bring in scientists and they'll give you a couple of hours of training, and then they'll send you out onto the Hill to meet with congressional staffers for the House of Representatives and staffers for the Senate. And you spend the day running around to the offices and conveying important messages regarding science. It was really interesting. I did this about 15 years ago. The staff who run the offices are amazing people. They're smart. They're incredibly hardworking. They work terribly long hours. Surprisingly young. Many of them are just a few years out of school, and that's in part because a lot of the staff just gets burned out. The job is so hard, and it's so demanding that many of them last a few years and then they move on. But there are some staffers who've been there for 20 years. We were warned during the training, and it happened when we met with every single staff member. They had 3 questions for us when we walked in, and we was a small group of scientists who were assigned to each visit. So there were 2 or 3 of us who went to meet with each staff group from individual offices. In one case, we actually met with a congressperson. That was Jane Harmon from Southern California, quite a senior member of Congress. But mostly we met with the staff. Every single person asked us 3 questions in one way or another. Why are we here? Why should they care? And what do we want them to do about it? Every single one asked those questions. So it's good to practice and be ready to answer those questions in about 20 or 25 words. They can't take a long story. And in this case, because we were focused on basic research, our primary talking point was basic research is important. Please support basic research through your work as a member of Congress. That was it. We tried to emphasize for individual staff offices what were the important benefits to their district or their state for supporting basic research. But that was the message, pretty plain and not directly self-serving. It was more about serving the scientific community overall. The thing to realize is that most politicians are being pulled in lots of different directions. They need us to give them with the ammunition that they need to fight our fights for us. Not every congressional rep or agency representative is an advocate for science, but many of them are. What they lack in many cases is what they need from us, the ideas and the assertions and the hard information to back up support for science. And so what we're trying to do when we appear in front of them as advocates is give them what they need to work on our behalf. It's a synergistic relationship. In many cases, they have to work within a system. So it's helpful if you're not telling them that they should do something that's never been done before. You know, you should create a brand new agency that supports my research. Well, that's not going to happen. So what they need is help to work within the system they have. In some cases, there's an opportunity to do something completely new. So you can be ready for that. But I think to be effective, you want to think about the reality that they have to face in doing their work. As scientists, we're also often asked to serve in an advisory capacity on scientific panels, for example, reviewing proposals, but I also get asked to serve many times on city or county or regional or state water agencies and boards. And I try to do a certain amount of that each year. I carve out a little bit of time, that's my service time, and I try to be picky and choose things that I think are going to be beneficial overall. It's important to recognize the time commitment. If you're going to appear before a panel even once, you've got to do your homework and be prepared. And so you want to be sure that it's not, even if you're going to appear for an hour, you might spend 8 hours getting ready for a 1-hour visit, and that might include 5 minutes in front of the person you need to talk to. Be ready for that commitment or don't do it. And try to be thoughtful and constructive. I have a hard time with this. I get angry, I get frustrated, and it's important to be constructive, be positive, be optimistic. These are folks who are working very hard on our behalf, and they need something to feel good about and to feel positive about. And so be the highlight of their day, and you're going to be more effective. And finally, I want to talk about speaking with the public at large. In thinking about this today, making this presentation, and thinking back more broadly, I think that we are all now in a really awkward position. And I think part of the reason for that is that for the last 50 to 60 years, scientists have really treated the public with disdain. They've treated the public disrespectfully, and they've acted as if the public is obligated to support them to do their curiosity-driven research. The seeds of unhappiness were sown over many, many decades, and now we're reaping the whirlwind of mistrust. There's lots of reasons why there's a backlash against science right now, but I think this is one of them. And so I think we all have an obligation, each one of us, to rebuild public trust. And it's taken 50 or 60 years to destroy that trust, and it's going to take us 50 or 60 years to build it back. We just have to do it. We don't have a choice. We can get benefits sooner than that, but this is a long-term project, and I think we just have to realize that. Another problem that we had in our community is that for many years, scientists who were good communicators, good educators even, were considered to be less serious and inferior as scientists. My personal view is that this is just laziness and jealousy on the part of scientists who didn't choose to engage or spend time being good educators. I think doing great research and being a good teacher and communicating effectively are mutually self-supporting. They make us better in all three areas, and to decide not to do that is a mistake. So I encourage you to choose carefully how you plan to engage, but to plan to engage, because we need to fix this. There are many venues. You cannot do all of them, and you don't want to have a scattershot approach where you flit off here and there, and you just give a little talk here as a one-off in a school, and then a one-off at a museum, and then a short thing here. Try to come up with a plan, something where you can build through your presentations, through your programs, so that your time is effective. But there are many opportunities through schools, museums, bringing people into your lab, and then, of course, small group and one-on-one work, which we all do when we interact with the public, when we're traveling, when we're with our families, and so forth. Know your audience. The same graphics that you show in a scientific paper are generally rotten for presentation in a talk, even to a technical audience. And they are truly horrendous for presenting to a non-technical audience. So if and when you're ready to do this public work, spend time developing the materials that are going to help you to be effective. Clear language that's very direct. Make sure you've got one or maybe two key points. Stick with those points throughout the presentation. When you present something up front for motivation, make sure to come back to that point at the end to nail down the message that you're trying to get across. Use analogies, use metaphors. Tiny bit of humor is always helpful. And I can't encourage enough, practice. Stand in front of your computer, stand in front of a mirror, say the words out loud, time yourself, and practice. It gets easier as time goes by, but it really is important to take each of these opportunities seriously. I just wanted to show you one example. This is a pretty nice graphic that I sometimes show in scientific talks. It's a colorful map that shows the heat loss of the Earth. And you can see how the continents are made out there. And then it's this colorful image. It's got areas in blue that are kind of cool and areas in red which are kind of warm. The areas in red have more energy coming out. The areas in blue have less. The total heat loss of the Earth is 40 terawatts. You can see there's a scale. It's got units of milliwatts per square meter. Nobody knows what that means when we talk to the public. So I've taken this slide and then modified it. And now I get rid of the abbreviations. I describe the amount of heat coming out of the Earth as being a really big number. And I've modified the color scale so it just says more is red, less is blue. I talk about the figure for a minute, and then I say that this is the equivalent of 8 trillion of these 5-watt nightlight bulbs just scattered all around the Earth. And it's also equivalent to 470 trillion of these colorful holiday lights, one for every square meter of the planet. So there's enough heat coming off of the Earth that it could power 470 trillion holiday lights. And maybe someday we should try that because it would be awesome. When you're speaking to the public, be an advocate. You need to have your talking points ready. And so here's a couple. Studies have shown that up to 70% of our gross domestic product can be tracked directly to scientific and technical innovation. Many economic studies have looked at the cost-benefit of basic research, and what they find varies by study, but it's typically on the order of a 2-to-1 or a 5-to-1 payoff for basic research. Basic research is research where it's curiosity and discovery driven. It's not directly connected to a product as a goal that could be sold in the marketplace. But basic research creates new ideas and new products that do end up in the marketplace. The problem is you can't easily predict up front which ones will be successful. And what that means is the best, most efficient, most effective approach is to fund everything, to choose the best work, the best ideas, the things that are the most interesting, fund them, and let the marketplace of ideas sort out the winners and losers. Sometimes it takes decades. That's part of the reason why you can't know up front what's going to be valuable to the economy and to society. Other approaches are not as effective. If you try to pick the winners up front, those types of approaches do not generate the same level of benefit. It's also worth noting that because of the way research is done in the United States, it supports young people who then take on STEM careers inside and outside of science, careers where scientific understanding is valuable. And finally, the research itself is an industry. It supports the purchase of instruments and supplies and the training of people. And so the effect of research is to ripple out into the economy like many other parts of spending, private spending, state spending, federal spending. It has a footprint and it has benefits independent of the topic. You do need to be patient in talking with the public. It's hard. Sometimes the same words mean different things. So be ready. When you hear a question where it indicates that the word is being interpreted differently, acknowledge that and then fix it. Try to address that very directly. Sometimes people will approach public presentations looking for a fight, looking for a controversy. And this is hard. I have a hard time with it myself. It comes up a lot with water, and it comes up with climate change. In general, try not to engage on the level at which you're being engaged. Try to step around those issues as best you can. And one way to do that is to focus on the science as the process of testing ideas and discovery. I think that's an aspect that people don't hear enough about, and it's a way sometimes to avoid some of the controversies. Try to be respectful, of course, as best you can, even when there's disagreement. That said, you're allowed to be firm about what's known and what's unknown. If there are ideas that have been tested again and again and again, and they have failed to be disproven, you can be emphatic about that. But it is hard to avoid getting frustrated and getting angry. I struggle with it. Be grateful when you present to the public. We are incredibly lucky through most of human history, even in the modern era, since the Industrial Revolution, life was a lot harder than it is now. Many fewer people could afford to be scientists. We are lucky to live in a place and a time when we can do this as our profession. It's a privilege, and we've got to recognize that. I find people who are upset sometimes, they back off when we express a little bit of humility and appreciation for simply getting to do what we do. You'll often get the question, who pays for that? When you talk to someone about exotic research in a submarine or in a drill ship, who pays for that? Very common. And the answer is you do, and I thank you for that. It's important to acknowledge that and to be grateful for that kind of support. Overall, I think it's important to be humble and resolute about the importance of what we do. Our jobs are honorable jobs, and they are necessary. Many have come before us with great discoveries, and so we're able to do what we do because we follow in the footsteps of giants. And they paved the way for us, and they showed us the way to be effective and to contribute to society. And I also like to tell people this is the best time ever to be a scientist. There is so much that's going on with technology and discoveries and the sharing of information and collaboration. And expressing excitement about the way we work is probably the best way to get the public on board with being part of it and supporting what we do. With that, I just want to acknowledge many people who have helped over the years in studies where I've engaged with the public and the press and politicians. Of course, all of the agencies who fund this work, especially the NSF and the drilling program and C-DEBI, and all the technicians and colleagues and others who have been at sea and in the field with us who help us to get our work done. And with that, I am very happy to answer any questions that you guys have. Thanks for your attention. So Stephanie asks, how do you separate yourself as a scientist from your personal views when speaking to different audiences? This is also really hard, and it comes up quite often in the context of freshwater resources, for example. One way is to acknowledge, I'll say, well, let me put on my hat as a scientist, or let me put on my hat as a researcher and tell you what some of the issues are. So I'll often talk about the issues rather than passing a judgment on the issues. And I'll say it very explicitly. And if people keep pushing, they say, well, what do you think? What's right? What do you think? One way to approach that is to say, all right, I'm going to take off my scientist hat and I'm going to put on my personal hat. But before I answer the question, I'll just tell you that what I think personally is no more important than what any of you think. That as a citizen, we can all have these views, and I don't think I'm any more equipped to have an opinion about, say, the way that water rights should be set up, or you know, the way that the federal budget ought to be distributed. I mean, these are big issues, and they go well beyond science. So I think if I'm pushed, I'll give an opinion, but I really try to say this is different from me functioning as a scientist. But it's hard. It's hard. When you're committed to something and you've been working in a field for a long time, you'll have opinions. And I think it's just important to try to highlight that you realize that. I think people are willing to accept opinions if you're willing to indicate where that begins in your discussion. Yeah, Jesse asks, he says, I'll be looking over the slides. Do you have references for things like the innovation drives GDP or the cost benefit? I have to admit, I Googled over the weekend, and I went to a number of research papers Often there were sites, like many people, I'll start at Wikipedia, but then I try to find the papers. I didn't save them. And probably I should, and it would probably be good if in a presentation like this, here's another lesson that I just learned. Talking to scientists, I didn't prepare for this audience correctly. And what I should have done was actually gotten some of those citations and had them ready. But what I will say is it was possible to find these results within 2 clicks on queries like value of basic research and impact of research on the economy. If you just type in a couple phrases like that, you'll very quickly come to papers in the economic literature, peer-reviewed meta-analyses, as well as individual analyses, and you'll come up with those numbers. Stephanie asks, what's your recommendation for how early career professionals can balance their research and their outreach? This is a great question. When I was first hired here as a tenure track faculty member, I had a whiteboard. It's over here on the side of my office, and I marked out a big rectangle at the top of that whiteboard, and I wrote the word ruthless across the whiteboard. And what I meant there was to remind myself that I had to be ruthless about my time, that I needed to think hard about when I worked on something, where was that going to appear? Where would it appear in the public? Where would it appear in a journal, at a meeting? And where would it appear on my CV when I went up for review in 2 years? You have to think about that. You cannot be effective as a scientist if you don't establish and maintain a successful career. Here at the University of California, we do value research and education and outreach and engagement service. It's a formal part of our review, but they're not equal. I know that. I know that research leads. No one's going to give me a hard number, but I'd have to say, I know when I'm being evaluated 50 or 60, maybe 70% of that evaluation will be based on my research. I have to know that. 25, 30%, 40% is going to be my teaching. And the other part, 5 or 10%, is going to be education and outreach. If you think of it that way, and then you look at your week, and if you work like a lot of scientists do, a 50-hour week, maybe a little more, you can allocate 5% of your time or 10% of your time to education and outreach every week and be ruthless about how you allocate your time. The hard part is following through on that. It doesn't mean in 1 week you can't spend 2 days on an education program, but it might mean that in the following 2 weeks you spend 0 time in order to maintain that balance. One thing I do recommend for any junior scientist or faculty member is keep a log of your work and enter information every week on your accomplishments. When you come around to going up for review, you'll need to document what you've done and how you've been spending your time. It's much easier to do that if you keep a record. People who work in industry, they do that all the time. Lawyers do it, doctors do it, many professionals do this. They record their time because they need to record their billable hours. Treat your time like billable hours and be ruthless. Think about how much time do you have this week and what do you want to spend it doing? And allocate a dedicated time to work on your education and outreach, whatever that is, and allocate the rest of your time for your other goals. Maybe you'll be in a job where you get to put in more time, like 20%. That would be great. Maybe your job is education and outreach, and then you're at 80 or 90%. But you've got to be honest about that and carve out a limit of the amount of time that you're willing to spend.
All right.
Any
Well,
more questions
I don't
for you
believe there are any more questions. Wait a couple seconds. But with that, Andy, thank you. Like I mentioned, this will be posted on the C-DEBI professional development webinar series, so you can go back and watch it again. And with that, I will thank Andy and sign off. Thank you.
Okay. Thanks, everybody. Appreciate it. Bye, Stephanie. Thanks, Matt.
Bye.